My name is Claudine Tinellis. I'm a writer and podcaster, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Metcalfe Auditorium today for this exciting panel discussion with authors Amanda Hampson, Joanna Jenkins, and Sean Wilson. Thank you. Now, just a few housekeeping announcements before we kick off the session. If you could all kindly mute your mobile phones for the duration. Recording of the sessions is not permitted. However, we encourage you to take as many photos as you wish, but no flash, please. We'd love for you to share your photos on social media. Feel free to tag Bad Crime Sydney or use the hashtag Bad Crime Sydney. At the end of the session, we'll have some time for questions, and if you're joining us on Zoom, please send your questions through using the Q&A function on Zoom about 20 minutes before the end of the session, and I will do my best to get these questions answered for you. Now, as crime fiction devotees, as most of you, I'm sure you are in the audience here today, many of you will know that already know the appeal of the genre. From hardcore detective novels to psychological suspense, thrillers and cosy mysteries, there's something for every reader. But from a writing point of view, it's been interesting to see a veritable explosion of Australian crime stories in recent times where the protagonists, and therefore primary investigators of the relevant central mystery, are not from law enforcement. The rise of the amateur sleuth or would-be detective, determined to help solve the puzzle and right the wrongs of the world. It's not a new phenomenon, of course. The amateur detective route is well trodden with some legendary characters, a testament to the popularity of this subgenre. Of Miss Marple, a lauded amateur sleuth, her creator Agatha Christie, via one of her other characters, Sir Henry Clithering, said, "What makes Miss Marple so effective as a detective is her ability to blend into the background. Unassuming and often overlooked, she has the freedom to pursue the truth." And I put it to you today, dear audience, there are authors here today who've created characters in the same vein. Unassuming, often overlooked, but with the kind of intelligence that makes for the best kind of truth seeker. So without further ado, allow me to introduce them to you. Amanda Hampson is a Melbourne-based author of two non-fiction titles and 7 novels. Her latest, The Tea Ladies, published earlier this year by Penguin Random House, is a highly entertaining, cosy crime novel that follows the adventures of tea lady Hazel Bates and her friends when they uncover evidence of a kidnapping, arson, and even murder in the course of their duties. Welcome, Amanda. Joanna Jenkins is a Brisbane-based author and one-time partner of an international law firm whose debut novel, How to Kill a Client, was published by Allen and Unwin at the beginning of this year. A grippingly compulsive novel which spotlights power and revenge in the hallowed halls of big law when a major client dies in suspicious circumstances. Welcome, Joanna. And finally, Sean Wilson. Sean is a Melbourne-based writer and communications professional whose debut novel, Gemini Falls, was published in 2022 by Affirm Press. This was a beautiful coming-of-age story about 13-year-old Morris Turner, who returns to his parents' home with his family when his father is called on to investigate a murder. Set in Melbourne as the Great Depression begins to take hold, Morris and his friends are determined to help solve the crime, unconvinced that the townspeople's suspicions about the killer are correct. Welcome, Sean. So, Amanda, I might start with you. Congratulations on this delightful novel. I think it's fair to say that The Tea Ladies is a departure in style from your previous work. So I wondered if you could tell us more about the story and how you came to write it.
Well, is this working? People hear me? I've been writing what's called women's fiction. I always write about older women. That's important to me because I think we get overlooked generally in fiction, in films. Here we are, these incredibly capable women, and we're always presented as a little bit doddery and a little bit silly, and I don't approve of that kind of thing. So I was always writing older characters, and when I was young, I was a huge fan of Agatha Christie, read lots and lots of Agatha Christie's, and so I thought I'd like to try my hand at something different. And I was reading a Facebook page called Australia Remember When. That's one of those Facebook pages. Maybe some people here follow it. Boomers get on there and go on about how things used to be good and now they're not. And wasn't it great when we had a dunny man and we didn't have flushing loos, things like that. Anyway, there was a picture of a tea lady, and she had a trolley and the cups and had a big double-handed teapot. And there were hundreds and hundreds of comments saying, "Oh yes, I remember Mabel, and she was so lovely," and da da da. And then somebody said the tea lady knew where the bodies were buried, and it was literally a light bulb moment because I thought, because I was a teenager in the 60s and growing up in the 60s, I was very aware of the social stratas back then, that companies were all in the same building, the factory would be at the bottom, the managing director at the top, and the factory girls would never go to the top of the building. It just wouldn't happen. And so I thought, okay, well, here we have our perfect amateur sleuth, overlooked, underestimated, and she has diplomatic immunity. She goes everywhere in the building. She knows absolutely everything. So then I thought, well, maybe she would have a cohort of other tea ladies. And so they could draw on tea ladies. So when this building's burnt down, she says to one of the other tea ladies, "Who's the tea lady at the fire station now?" I said, "Oh, that's Effie Finch. Let's get her down, see what she's got to say." So it was just a really, really fun premise of all these incredibly capable women working behind the scenes, and so much fun. So much fun.
It absolutely is, and I'm sure it was to write. Now, your book is set in Sydney, Surrey Hills in 1965, but the Tea Lady wasn't an office institution, or it was an office institution for some time after that, wasn't it?
I think that tea ladies were there sort of 40s, 50s, 60s, and started to really die out in the 70s. In fact, the next in the series, The Cryptic Clue, the nemesis of the tea ladies appears, which is the cafe bar, if anybody remembers that ghastly machine. And I think Dot Strong, who's one of the most famous tea ladies, the ABC tea lady, who evidently served over 1 million cups of tea, I think she was there till like 1982, something like that.
We had a tea lady called Elaine in 1980. I forget when I started work, but anyway, it was something like 1987 or 1989,
Wow.
and then she was in 90.
Yeah.
But I still remember her name.
Literally.
She,
Or,
no, she was putatively.
we're talking crime here.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry.
Thought I had a new plot line there.
Now, I really loved Hazel. I think she epitomised not only the benefits to staff and the company generally of having a dedicated tea lady, but she had all the qualities necessary to be a Miss Marple-like character, didn't she?
Yeah, look, I have to say I haven't actually read Miss Marple. I see some things on TV and she looks all little and frail and wears funny little hats and things. I just see Hazel as being a very clear-minded, fair, kind person who's very, very capable. And she does the thing that all women do, but older women particularly. If they don't know something, they ring somebody who does. Can you help with this? Do you know something about this? I think we're very happy to say we don't know things. And I think women are very collaborative in that regard. So that sort of played in perfectly with someone like Hazel, who's good at pulling in those strings.
Yeah, she certainly was. Now, Joanna, if I could turn to you for a moment. Given my own experiences as a corporate lawyer, and I think we were talking about it just earlier in the green room, but it turns out Joanna and I actually worked for the same law firm, quite coincidentally. Although Joanna worked in the Brisbane office and I worked in the Sydney office. But anyway, given my experiences as a corporate lawyer at the big end of town, I couldn't help but be completely invested in this novel from the outset. And like one of your protagonists, Viv, you were the only female partner in your law office for a little while. So I wondered if you could walk us through how you first conceived of the idea for this story.
Well, I always wanted to write a book, and I was always going to get to it one day, but I kind of got waylaid in this other kind of legal career, which was fairly absorbing. But when I stopped doing that, I wanted to write a book about corporate greed and the sort of culture at the big end of town, not just in law firms, although it's kind of fairly nicely epitomised in law firms. And I was sort of wondering how I should put the book together. And then I thought, well, I need something to kind of propel, I could write a lyrical novel about about what it's like to be in a meeting all day, but it probably wouldn't be terribly interesting. So I thought, I know, I'll kill one of the fuckers. And that's how it actually came to be crime. And in fact, it wasn't even, there was some difficulty classifying it as crime, but then Gabby Nair, my agent, who is sitting right over there, said, oh, it's definitely crime, Wilson. And that's how I came to be in the genre.
Well, it is most definitely crime, that is for sure, and a wonderful, terrific one at that. Now, the story has 3 points of view, and each of them women who give us different perspectives on the dead client's character. But one, I have to say, emerges as the natural investigator. I wondered if you could tell us more about her, and did you know that she was the one who would be instrumental in helping to solve the crime, or did she reveal herself to you as you were writing?
No, I wanted to. So I assume you're talking about Ruth, the
Yes.
character. So she comes from. She's actually in the Sydney office and has the general view that people have of Brisbane if they're from Sydney, which is that it's yeah. Joe Bjelke-Petersen is no longer in power. Although, anyway, we won't go into politics. What was the question?
Ruth has
Ruth.
emerged.
So I actually, no, she was deliberately put together as a character who would come in and see the culture afresh and have a raised eyebrow, but she had her own issues, so she really didn't want to get involved. She wanted to come into Brisbane, spend as little time there as possible, interact with the people in the Brisbane office as little as possible, and then go home. But she kind of gets sucked into it. So I just wanted her to be very detached. And to, as it's revealed to her, start going, oh God, it's even worse than the Sydney office, which is...
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, were Ruth and Viv based on anyone in particular that you know? Or how about we say, did you get inspiration from any real-life characters for the characters of this novel?
You mean any of them?
Yeah, any of them.
Well, that was a bit squeaky then, wasn't it? I'm often all my previous partners, who are mostly blokes, all have theories about who the blokes who are the baddies. No offence, but they tend to be the baddies. They all have theories about who's what, and it's incorrect because the disclaimer I have at the beginning of the novel that they're all compendium characters is completely correct. Like they're no one in particular, but because they're no one in particular, they are a lot of people. So I've had friends who work at university who say, I didn't know you knew my head of department. So I think, yeah, you do see them in other, just generally in working life, I think.
Stereotypical characters, perhaps.
Yeah.
Sean, Gemini Falls is a stunning story. Congratulations. You were able to evoke in this novel the incredible hardships and otherness created by the Great Depression, the fear engendered by the camps of homeless people who took up residence on the outskirts of towns. So why did you want to write about this era, and did you know when you sat down to write it that it would be a crime novel?
Yeah, much like Joanna, I started with themes. So I wrote another novel manuscript before this one, and that was based on my dad's mum's experience. She had dementia, and so I wrote a story. It was really kind of like a family drama with the protagonist with dementia who's kind of slipping in and out of the past and present, which was something, there's a really tragic part of dementia and something that I witnessed her doing towards the end of her life. And that was kind of the basis for that story, which will be my next novel, actually. But as part of that process, I was thinking a lot about my grandparents and the kind of life that they had and the particularly hard life that they had. And so on my dad's side, his mum was raised by an alcoholic mother with a shell-shocked father and essentially kind of raised by her sisters. And his dad was abandoned by his mum in a market in Manchester when he was a kid, and then so there's a lot of kind of sadness and trauma around that side. And then on my, I started thinking about my mum's side and what I knew about her dad, and he was one of 13 kids raised during the Depression. They had to catch rabbits to feed the family when he was a kid, and so that kind of level of destitution immediately, it's nothing that I know. So I wanted to learn more about it. And once I started to read some of the historical accounts of that time, very quickly you find out that a lot of people were forced out of their homes. There were essentially riots in the street when people were forced out of their homes. That's another story, but people were forced out of their homes, and many people ended up living by the river or in council land or in makeshift shelters on the coast. There were plenty in Sydney. There were some near the airport. And so they were called tin towns and bag towns, related to the scrap material that people used to make these shelters. So that immediately became very interesting to me, and I wanted to, how can I tell a story where there are these people who are displaced and what it does to that community, and that community, the prejudice and the xenophobia of the people who are displaced and moving to other parts of the city to try and shelter their families. And so then, much like Joanna, how do I tell that story? And so very quickly I started to think, well, maybe it could be a crime story. How do you build the pressure on a community? Maybe there's a crime, and then that itinerant displaced community gets blamed for the crime. And that's how you can explore some of those themes. So yeah, it really came out of not initially wanting to write a crime story, but thinking about how you build that pressure and how you can explore the choices and decisions people make under those circumstances.
Yeah. Now, why was Morris the person you chose to tell this story? I mean, what made him the character best suited to help solve the mystery behind the murder?
Probably because I know nothing about being a detective, and so I didn't think I could really write like that. And I am interested in coming-of-age stories. I think there's probably something particular about a coming-of-age story that lends itself well to exploring those universal themes of xenophobia, prejudice, populism, the things that happened around that time, and there are parallels between then and now. Like the rampant greed and unregulated financial markets leading to flow-on effects in the community. So yeah, I thought there's an opportunity when you've got a young protagonist for them to, for the mysteries of the world, that some of the things that we already know about, for them to start to be revealed to a person when they're around 13 years old, and some of the things that you start to find out about the world you don't really like. And I thought that was interesting for that to be, for the really dramatic changes that were happening at the time, and that we see some parallels of happening now with people living in tents in parks, seeing that through a child's eyes and them asking questions, why is this happening, and exploring it in that way.
Yeah. Amanda, if we could just come back to you for a moment. I wanted to know if you could tell us about Zigzag Lane. Why did you choose Surrey Hills or the rag trade as the setting for this novel?
Zigzag Lane is a sewing stitch. Yeah. So there isn't really a zigzag lane.
No. Sorry, I should have said, yes, it is fictional, but why that area?
Surrey Hills. Okay, so I suppose it's kind of putting together components. So when I got the idea of the tea ladies that I could sit at the 50s, sit in the 60s, then I started to think about what industry they would be in. Now, in my backpacking years, I went to the UK, and I was living in Liverpool for a while, and I worked in a garment factory. And I was one of the queen bees who worked in the office. And so then I thought, that would be great. That would be, set it in a garment company. And then, of course, Surrey Hills was obvious because everything is still there. Even the signs on the building are there. And I then went to the Jewish Museum and got lots and lots of information from there about the people that had started that. A lot of background, and so that just seemed natural. So the thing about Surrey Hills, so there's two things. Surrey Hills was an area of great crime, and part of that is the laneways. Everywhere there's laneways, same in Fitzroy where I live now, laneways allow for hidden transactions. And so that sort of gives rise to a lot of crime. And there was a lot of poverty there. And in fact, on the Tea Ladies Walk this afternoon, Elliot, who's a historian, talks about how Surrey Hills came to form. And I did the tour with him a couple of years ago. It was absolutely fascinating how a suburb becomes full of crime and full of, poverty. On the other side, I thought, okay, if I sit in the 60s in the garment industry, and then this catastrophic thing happened in 1965 at the Melbourne Cup at the end of October. There's a lady nodding here. You know what it was, right? When Jean Shrimpton wore a short dress and the entire country lost its mind, and it was on the front page of every single paper. And I thought, oh, that'd be really interesting to bring that into the industry and have it flipped on its head, because, conflict is story, story is conflict. So each part of the story needed to have some conflict. So I felt very confident bringing that conflict into Empire Fashion Wear, name says it all, and having that upset happening in there and seeing what happened next.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. So tell us more about this tour of Surrey Hills that's happening this afternoon. And you just mentioned that you did it a couple of years ago. So what does the tour take in, and what do people expect to see?
This is the Tea Ladies tour, which is so funny. Yeah, so what happened is I wanted to do a tour of Surrey Hills, and Elliot runs a company called Murder's Most Foul. He studied history at Sydney Uni, so he knows a lot about Sydney. And as it was that we had inclement weather and I was the only one who turned up. So we had a fabulous time. We walked all over and talked about murder and had lunch together, and so we've kept in touch. He came to my launch, and so now he's put together a Tea Ladies tour where he's, gone through the book and taking us down all the places that I've kind of based the story on. And that happens starting at Central Station at 4 o'clock this afternoon. So that should be really fun.
Yeah, I wish I could do it. I think I will, actually, at some stage. Now turning to you, Joanna. For me, one of the best lines in this book is when Viv says to Ruth of the dead client, "Everyone is going to say what a great guy and what a great lawyer he was. He wasn't. He was a prick and a shithouse lawyer." Now, this was just gold for me. It epitomises not only this idea that it's disrespectful to speak of the ill, and disrespectful to speak ill of the dead, even when it's the truth, but that these bad qualities were overlooked by everyone in the firm simply because this client wielded all the power. And Viv wasn't the only one to think that, but she had a hard time making anyone believe her. Law's Old Boys Club definitely at work there. Tell us more about this and why Ruth was really the only person who could feasibly shed light on it.
The fees are everything. So in the corporate world, the money is the reason why you get up in the morning. I should say it won't overcome the basic ethical issues. I look in horror at what that whole tax issue with PwC. I just can't believe they didn't see that was a fundamental conflict of interest. So I do caveat my remarks by saying I really don't think that a law firm would be in that area. But having said that, the money talks, and so if there is a client who's offering tens, possibly even hundreds of millions of dollars in fees every year, they will be forgiven a lot. They have an enormous amount of power, and power corrupts. I've seen people move into those positions where they become in effect the client, so they go from being the lawyer who does the work and go into the corporate world to effectively be the client. And they realise after a while their behaviour can be appalling, and it becomes appalling, and sometimes there's a moment of self-reflection, but generally they move on pretty quickly after that. So, and not all of them are like that, but there are some who are just awful, just terrible. And they probably don't start out as awful people. It's the sort of culture that forgives a lot of very bad behaviour, as a consequence of which the behaviour just keeps pushing the envelope.
So tell us why Ruth was really the only person who could uncover this.
Well, Viv, the young female partner in the firm, who's being relentlessly bullied by this fellow, is fairly powerless. So ostensibly, she's been made a partner. So on the face of it, she looks like she has a lot of power, and from the point of view of the staff, she probably does. But when it comes to forging her way in the firm, it's going to be about how many fees that she can charge, and so really she just has to sublimate herself to this fellow and do what she can to get the work from him, and no one's going to listen to her. If they don't want to hear, no one wants to hear what may be obvious to them, but they just don't want to talk about it or sort of countenance the idea that there may be something really quite unpleasant about him, because that's just business. That's the way it works. And so Ruth coming in and looking at him and going, it's not great. But even she didn't do much about it until she had to.
Indeed. Now, my next question is to all of you. As with all of the novels we're discussing today, I think it's fair to say that the police would not necessarily have solved the crime without the assistance of our trusty amateur sleuths, or at the very least it would have taken them longer to solve the crime. But I wondered, was it difficult to balance their actions with due process and proper procedure, do you think?
Well, I have a cop on payroll, but he doesn't get any pay. He was and I think he wouldn't mind me saying this, a corrupt cop. He's off-sided to Roger Rogerson back in the 1970s. So he has been absolutely invaluable. So he not only knows, the procedure, which you actually can't find. You can't Google police procedure 1965, New South Wales. You have to actually know how things are done. And so he reads a manuscript and he says, well, that wouldn't happen. But he's also heard a lot of lies and a lot of stories with holes in, and he can see the holes in my story, which is absolutely amazing. So he'll say, well, this person just doesn't have enough motivation. So I feel as though I've been able to get a really good balance of what the sleuth might uncover and what the police would do. And he came up with some great ideas. Initially, I had one cop at Surrey Hills and one in the CIB, and they, are on this case. He said that CIB would not even talk to somebody from Surrey Hills. So he said, why don't you have him kicked out of CIB? And then he becomes this guy's boss in Surrey Hills. So I couldn't have thought of that because I just don't know how the process works. But if I can also say, he's very fond of Hazel. And in the third in the series that I'm working on now, I have the Painters and Dockers come on the scene, if anybody remembers them. They were a big criminal gang, yeah. He said, you can't put Hazel with the Painters and Dockers. That's the toe cutter gang. You just can't put her in there, so that's nice too.
Indeed. I mean, Joanna, I was thinking specifically about Ruth and D.S. Messer and how Ruth walked a really fine line in balancing legal professional privilege and cooperating with the police on the investigation.
Yes. So Ruth doesn't really do anything until, about the crime until Sharon Messer walks in and says, we think the guy was murdered. And in fact, a colleague of one of my sons who used to be in the police force said the only thing she found unbelievable about my book was that a female police officer would have got a homicide investigation. So things have not moved on. But the only reason why she got the homicide investigation was because she kept up. She was the one who insisted on the tests being done. Because, apart from the woman with the mushrooms, the poisoning with the mushrooms, which I find fascinating, you don't hear about poisoning deaths in Australia, and they happened a lot in the 1920s, or they must have. Well, Agatha Christie
in
was
the
very
60s as
sorry,
well.
Yeah, they must still happen. It's just, don't you think?
Like better at it.
Yeah.
Did.
Or they don't get investigated because unless it's something like the mushroom murders when it's. Oh well, yeah, but you don't, it's not something that's on the front pages a lot. You don't hear a lot about it. So Sharon Messer sort of does kick it off, and then Ruth thinks, well, that what's happening inside the firm is going to be very opaque to the police. You know, the sort of politics within the firm, which gave everybody a motive to kill this person, would be very hard for the police officer to sort of pin down and root out.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sean, in the book, in the case of Gemini Falls, I was thinking about how Morris really pushed against the boundaries of what he knew his father would allow him to do in the pursuit of truth. His father, obviously, being the police officer that was sent to the town to investigate the murder.
Yeah, and I think I cheated a little bit by keeping the perspective really close to Morris. So I don't really know anything about how a crime is solved by a real detective. So I just kept really close on Morris and his cousin and friend as they go through this informal investigation, which I think is an interesting and probably very convenient way for me to do it. It's interesting because I guess you stray away from that regular trail that a lot of those kinds of stories go on. So you can they can kind of go into places that a regular detective wouldn't go in. And so in one scene, the kids go into the displaced persons camp, the Tin Town, which the detective just wouldn't be able to do. And so they go in there, and because they follow some other kids from families that are living out there, and so you get some opportunities, I guess, to explore certain things and places in the town that you just wouldn't get if it was following really closely with a proper detective.
Yeah, absolutely. Continuing with you, Sean, life for Morris and his family in Melbourne and then later in Gemini Falls is so rich with details about the deprivations common at the time, the fear, as you mentioned, xenophobia, the tensions and unrest caused by the conditions at the time. But I thought you did such a wonderful job at balancing this with examples of community spirit and cooperation. I wondered if you could talk more about that.
Yeah. I think that lots of the stories that I enjoy, there's a balance between light and dark, and you can have a really serious and horrible situation, and you can find the examples of people coming together and helping each other out in those. It's really not hard to find, and there are lots of personal accounts of that time where people talk about how families helped each other out, how communities got together and supported one another, which I think is important to show that as well. You've got to show both sides of that story. The governments of the time didn't really do much to help people out, and so it was really up to charitable organisations. The Country Women's Association was huge at the time, feeding a lot of people who would have gone hungry otherwise, and so this is long before a lot of the social welfare programs sprung up, and as ineffective as they are, at least there is something now, but there was essentially nothing back then, and so it was a lot of informal networks that got together and helped people out, and so I think that's important to show as well. And just, I'm sure there was lots of laughs as well, even when you're in such a tough situation. If I think about my mum's dad, he had a really tough life. One of 13 kids, went hungry all the time, went off to war when he was 17. Was a truck driver, kind of never really had much, but he was one of the funniest person I've ever known. So you can show that, I think, that people that are in a tough situation still find humor and still find, there's people fall in love, people have friendships that'll last forever. You've got to show that as well.
And you did so beautifully. Amanda, all the tea ladies were such nuanced and richly drawn characters. No one could forget Irene Turnbuckle in a hurry, nor Betty with her fastidious note-taking skills, and Merle, who knits and bakes the best sponge cakes. These were characters shaped by the times that they lived in, and as Hazel astutely says to Irene at the beginning of the novel, Irene dear, we're tea ladies, everything is our business. So I wondered, how did you get inside these characters' heads?
Well, I don't want to sound all arty-farty, but it's just one of those things where I try not to, I hear people say, oh, I make the character do this. I just don't do that. I try to get them on the page and just see what they've got to say. And I think if you have some kind of development between them, they will gradually start to have their own voices. So I am, everybody knows the planners and the pantsers, and I'm very much a pantser. I just do not know what the second sentence is going to be. So creating the characters, I would fill a whole exercise book just writing about the characters generally. So I kind of know them before I get them on the page and start writing about them. And when you've got somebody like Irene, who is a stirrer, and I am a little bit of a stirrer myself, she is going to wind people up a bit, and then we see people having a little bit of a go at each other, and I think older women, when you've known each other 20, 30, 40 years, your friends, they do become a little more annoying as you get older, but you kind of, look, everybody goes, but you're kind of used to them, and, you forgive them a lot, and sometimes you have little squabbles, and, or you get off the phone, oh, so annoying. But then you just push on because you've got this history, and that's what I wanted to have with these women. Sometimes they'll have a little bit of a spat, and then they'll say, oh, see you at the pub later? Yeah, I'll be there. And, on we go.
Yeah, I absolutely loved it. And if you haven't read this book, you really, really must. It's just wonderful. Joanna, I think it's fair to say that your experiences in Big Law informed every nuance of this story. And I couldn't help but laugh in delight at how accurately you portrayed some of these characters. And you mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I just kind of want to expand on that a little bit more. And were you at all worried about how your book would be perceived by your colleagues or ex-colleagues, as the case may be?
Or clients.
Or clients.
Was I worried? Not really. Oh, no.
That's great.
No, and that even seems odd to me because I'm naturally a profoundly anxious person. But I wasn't worried about it. I did. I gave people versions of it to read, and people I worked with. And if they came to me and said, as one of my dear friends did, I think that this character is based on X, and I thought, oh, well, if you think that, I need to change the character. So I changed the way he looked and the way he acted. Unfortunately, she then went and spoke to X's best mate and said, oh, Joe's written a character about, X. And then everybody, and then I had X's wife saying, which one is he? And I said, well, if you can't tell, then clearly none of them. But so, it did not keep me awake at night. What did keep me awake was people, texting one another, and I'd be shown the text that, I'd be sitting at lunch with someone, and they'd say, oh, look, I just got a text from someone saying that here are all the characters. And I said, I think that's defamatory. Like, I didn't do defamation law, but I think that might be defamatory. So why don't you text back and say, I think that's defamatory. Not what I wrote, but what you, but your assertion that these are actually the people. Yeah, so I've been,
Don't mess with Joanna. Now, I am conscious of the time, so I really wanted to offer each of these wonderful authors the opportunity to do a little bit of a reading from their work so that you could get a really good sense and flavour of what each of these stories might be about and their characters in particular. So, Sean, perhaps we could start with you.
Sure. It's going to be a little hard with a microphone and turning the pages. And I was going to read the first chapter. It's very short, but if it starts to get a little bit boring, maybe someone could play that walk-off music, like they do at the Oscars. We've only got about 4 pages. Is that okay? Yeah? Okay. The night Catherine Fletcher died, Capricornus was high in the northern sky. I know because I'm listening to Father talk about her on the telephone. I can see the grey hairs mixed in with the black of his beard, lit by the faint glow of the kerosene lamp. He's standing in the hall, speaking in his quiet voice. His hand is cupped over his mouth, but from where I am, crouched on the stairs, I can hear most of what he's saying. If there's one thing I've learned about men like Father, it's they can't, for the life of them, speak quietly on the telephone. They found Catherine Fletcher in a mine tunnel in Gemini, out near mountain country, underneath the bright stars of the Southern Cross, more than halfway along the road to New South Wales and some miles south of that. A long way from Melbourne, from our house in Hawthorn. I've seen Gemini marked on a map in Father's library, a little dot on paper wrapped by tight, curved lines. It's a small coal town in a valley between hills, barely 800 people to call it home. That's all Father has said about it in the few times he's talked about the town. It's where he grew up, where his whole family is from, but he hasn't been back in a long time. Something happened, something Father won't talk about, and the town and everyone in it are off limits for us. Her body was lying in Long Tunnel East, down along the sloping, narrow rail tracks they used to cart coal up from the depths. She was a few feet past the tunnel entrance, before you get to the lock gate. She had some clothes on, but not many, less than a young woman would wear outside her home. There were dark marks around her neck, marks that shouldn't have been there. She had 2 stab wounds in her back. Stabbed from behind, Father repeated through the telephone. Stabbed while she was walking away. She was on her back in the tunnel when they found her. No blood around, nothing soaked into the dirt. It was as if her blood had been drawn from her body and carried to the heavens. Her face was covered by long brown hair, laid down like a shroud. That's the word Father used. I repeat the word in my head. A shroud, a shroud, a shroud. I try to see it in my mind's eye. It makes me sick and sad at the same time. It had rained that night in Gemini, a big storm, the kind they often get there. That's what I know about Gemini, what I've put together from the newspapers and weather reports on the radio. A place of storms, a place where the clouds gather and settle. It had rained from midnight on. Catherine Fletcher was last seen by her mother at 8 that evening. She must have stolen out of her room after that, but her body was dry. She didn't get wet in the storm. That means she died between 8 and midnight before the first rain fell. Between the hours of 8 and midnight, Capricornus shining in the northern sky. People say the stars shine brighter in the country. The darkness makes them stand out. The furthest from here I've gone is some dairy farms and market gardens a horse ride away. I try to imagine them, the stars above Gemini, laid out like a quilt from one end of the sky to the other. I never knew Catherine Fletcher, never saw her in my life. Even so, I wish I could turn back the clock and stop that happening to her. I think about my sister and how I would feel if it was her lying in a tunnel, hair covering her face, rain falling outside. Father must be thinking the same. I see the way his shoulders slump, the way his head rolls to the side, as if weighed down by these thoughts. Something tells me he's thinking what it would be like to be Catherine Fletcher's folks, losing a daughter that way. My name is Morris Turner. I'm 13 years old. The man down there on the telephone is my father, Jude Turner, Detective Turner. My older sister is Charlotte, but everyone calls her Lottie. We used to be close. We used to tell each other everything. When we were younger, I would go to her room in the middle of the night when bad dreams haunted me. She would turn down the sheet, wrap an arm around me and hold me close. I'd feel her heart beating against my back and my breathing would slow. My eyelids would droop and close. I can't remember ever feeling better than that, taken from fear to comfort so fast, the speed of it making the good feeling stronger. These days she hardly talks to me. It's late. From my place on the landing of the stairs, I can see dust floating in the air above me and around me, lit by the warm glow of the lamp. It's pleasant the way it moves, the way each speck shifts like a star making its way across the night sky, making constellations in the air and then falling apart. Anyone keen on the stars knows at this time of year, Capricornus is highest in the middle of the evening, this time of year being late spring. Lottie told me Mother used to say you could see all of time in the stars. She said that in the sky, the same lights have shone down on every person who's ever lived. I wish I had the same memories of Mother, but I was too young. If I try to imagine it, I can almost feel her arm around me, her finger lifting my chin to the sky. I can almost be with her, looking up at the stars, our eyes taking in light from the galaxies. I've seen Gemini and Capricornus in the night sky, along with Sagittarius, Scorpius, and most of the rest. We've got an old telescope on the balcony, and some nights, when I've done my chores and the clouds have blown out of the sky, Father will let me use it. We'll stand there for hours looking at Orion and Centaurus and Hydra, calling out the names of the stars we see, old names that feel strange on my tongue. Father says people call Capricornus the gate of the gods. When you run a line between the stars and the constellation, it makes a shape that looks like an opening. People thought it was a gate where our souls pass after we die, the gate of the gods. I wonder if that was where Mother passed. I want to ask Father, but whenever I talk about Mother, a shadow passes over his face and he turns away or leaves the room. I can feel the words forming on my tongue, but I swallow them down. They go down deep inside my body where they join together, packed tight into bricks made of the words I can't say. He can't talk about her, and so I don't talk about her. Out in the hall, Father's voice gets louder. It's a storm cloud rising above me. One word is louder than all the others. It stays in the air, thunder rolling around the hall. Pregnant. Catherine Fletcher was pregnant when she died. She was little more than a child herself, Father says on the telephone, and she was almost a mother. Father says goodbye and drops the handset on the base. He sighs and runs his fingers through his hair. I can see the outline of his nose, the places where it's broken and healed, a crooked line, a constellation all his own. His back is hunched, his shirt hangs loose around him. I know I should go back to my room. I know I should lift one leg after the other, lift them up after step, but I can't do it. This isn't like me. I want to know more. I want to know more about Catherine Fletcher, and I want to know more about Gemini. Father told me whenever a star forms in the galaxy, a ring of gas and dust fills the space around it. The pull of the star makes those bits and pieces fall into orbit. It becomes a system, he said. A system pulls towards the star, and over time, the bits and pieces join together. Year after year, they get bigger and bigger until they become planets. That's how our planet came to be. The way I figure it, a murder is like a planetary system forming. People get pulled into orbit around it. They circle the crime side by side, everyone moving around and around that terrible thing. They can't help it. We're about to fall into orbit around Catherine Fletcher. I know it.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you. Joanna.
So this is near the beginning of the book where Ruth Dawson, the woman who lives in Sydney, has been asked by a client to move to Brisbane for 6 months to run a big case. Before Ruth made a final decision about the Brisbane thing, she wanted to run the idea past Roscoe. "Hello, Dale," she said, wandering into Roscoe's office with a cup of tea and sitting without invitation in a guest chair. Behind Roscoe, the harbour was at its sparkly best, 2 Manly ferries passing one another in the swell just inside the heads. Roscoe swung around from his computer screen. "Ruthie," he said. His repository of cheer was fathomless. It was the thing she liked best about him, that and his pragmatic tolerance of the vagaries of human nature, because in a big law firm, vagaries were always leaping out. "Any news?" Ruth asked. He shook his head. "I can't believe it." Ruth stayed silent, waiting for him to download, if that's what he needed to do. As chairman of partners, Roscoe kept the partnership secrets, and he knew that he could trust Ruth if he needed to run one by her. Anything he told her went straight into the place in her mind where she kept other people's classified information. She called it the vault. If a secret went in there, she filed it and locked it away with a clang of a heavy door and a turn of a huge key. Sometimes Roscoe couldn't tell her, such was the gravity of some of these secrets, and that was fine too. Ruth never pressured him to reveal anything. But this time, outrage prevented him from holding it in. Roscoe had received a call from a partner's wife complaining that her husband was sleeping with not one, but 3 senior associates at the same time. "Can't see where he'd find the time," Roscoe said, "or the energy." He paused and held out his hands, palms up. Also, why? Ruth wasn't in the mood to talk about the sexual peccadillos of the young bucks in the partnership, or to speculate on why they did patently stupid shit. "You need to sack him," she said. "Not the girls, the bloke." Roscoe nodded, resigned. "We're on it," he said. Usually Ruth would have followed up, made sure the firm didn't opt for the easy way out and fire the girls while keeping the partner on probation. But she had other things to talk about. "Brian wants me to move to Brisbane to do his case," she said, "for the rest of the year." "Brisbane," said Roscoe, in the same tone of wonder one might use in a discussion about moving to Pluto.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Joanna. And finally, Amanda.
Yes. Okay, so the chapters are from points of view of the different tea ladies. One is Hazel, one is Betty, and then there's another chapter from the point of view of the factory manager. So this is one of Betty's chapters. The ladies meet at lunchtime in the laneway, and between their, they'd serve tea and coffee in the morning and the afternoon, and then they have a get-together and eat their sandwiches in the lane. Hazel hardly has time to say hello and sit down before Irene, puffing away on her awful old pipe like an old sea captain, starts going on about her firm's secretary having it off with the boss. Irene's a terrible gossip and a bit coarse sometimes. I haven't got hard evidence, Irene tells him, but there's these looks. Lingering, interrupts Merle, making out she's an authority on this particular subject as well as everything else, or smouldering, there is a difference. Sort of goo-goo eyes, says Irene. Say if you got a new couch and couldn't stop thinking how beautiful it looked in your lounge room. Now, Betty would be the last person to bring up the fact that Irene rents a room in a horrible old boarding house. The fact is she doesn't have a couch or a lounge room for that matter, so that seems a funny comment coming from her. I definitely call that lingering, confirms Merle. Smouldering would be if Steve McQueen was stretched out on it. Betty can't help but giggle. Oh, you'd like that, Irene. Wouldn't say no to those baby blue eyes, Irene agrees, especially if he was in the nutty. Merle turns up her nose, rather unhygienic on the furniture. Anyway, you wouldn't pick this girl as the type, continues Irene. She's a chubby little thing. Chubby people have affairs too. Betty tugs indignantly at her own dress to rearrange the rolls around her waist. They're called womanly curves. And also, Irene, that secretary is not chubby. She's got an hourglass figure. More than an hour in her glass. Irene bares her dentures in a fierce grin. That's Irene, always stirring things up. Betty refuses to give her the satisfaction of an argument, apart from to say, you could do with putting on a pound or two yourself, Irene. You're just skin and bone. You're not really chubby, Betty, Merle reassures her. You've just got a small head. Betty frowns. Is that a compliment or two insults? What she's saying, Betty dear, is that you're perfectly proportioned, says Hazel, who has been silent until now. She only involves herself in these squabbles when they get too silly for words.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone. I think it's well and truly time for questions from the audience. If anyone's got a question, I think there will be a microphone that will make its way towards you. Just put up your hand if you have a question. If not, we can go to any Zoom questions if there are any. No Zoom questions? Okay. This one would be.
Hi, great talk, everyone. What do you all find the hardest bit about writing?
All of it.
Starting.
Look, I think writing crime is really tricky, and especially, all of my novels have had a twist in them, but this has to have lots of twists, and there's a whole smoke and mirrors thing happening where you have to get the reader to observe this, but not too much, but you're going to bring it back later, and they say, oh yeah, I remember that letter, that's what that was about. So I think it's really a very tricky genre, and it really did my head in, I have to say. The next one was much, much easier. But it's all pretty hard, I think. The first draft's hard. After that, it's fantastic.
Yeah, the planting, as you have to kind of plant things along the way, so you can spit out a first draft. Well, I say spit, it takes a long time to get the first draft out, and then you have to go sort of backtrack and make sure that for everything that happens on page 310, there's been a build-up to it that's not too obvious. Because one thing people on Goodreads don't like is guessing who the murderer was before they get to the last page,
Yeah.
and they'll tell you about it on Goodreads. Yeah, so that is I agree. That's the tricky part of it, and also making sure that when information comes out, you need to. I did it with having 4 different characters with points of view, but when information comes out, it comes out in a natural way, so that they're observing something from the room they're in, which later you'll see is relevant, but it's natural that that person in that circumstance is going to be seeing that thing and recording it for you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think it's really tricky to make the ending both surprising and inevitable. It can't just come from left field. It has to have the roots all the way through the story, but also be something you've hidden as well. But just in general, I think it's difficult to make a story both believable and familiar, but also not a cliche, just full of cliche and walking the same path that every other writer has. So you've got to try and do something different at the same time as make it a legitimate story that people will pick up and want to read. So everything, yeah.
Given that you've all chosen unusual investigators, what did you see as the thing that drove them to want to find out or do the investigating?
Well, my protagonist had to be dragged to it. She actually didn't care and had to be made to care. So getting her to change perspective, to change her sort of level of caring that was kind of tricky as well, to get her go from complete detachment to interest.
Yeah, I'd agree with that too. That classic hero's journey. The hero is really reluctant to leave their safe little world in the beginning, and so in my case, his cousin, who he meets for the first time when they go to Gemini, is a fan of detective novels, and she kind of pushes him. She starts the process, and her name's Flo. She's quite a fun character. She was really fun to write. Very, very forthright and very kind of not aggressive, but very assertive, enthusiastic character. And so she pushes and makes it happen. But then once it gets started, then you can't have your protagonist passive all the way through. Once he gets into the journey, then he's all in as well.
Well, from my point of view, older women already think they're in charge of the world. They're always telling people, pick up your dog poo and do this, and this hasn't happened the way I like it. And inquisitive. You tell your friends something, they say, well, that doesn't make sense. Why would she have said that? So I think it just comes absolutely naturally to older women to realise that it's not being solved by the people who should be solving it. So we just need to get on the job. It's the most natural thing in the world, I think.
I think we have time for one more question.
Sorry.
Yes, sorry.
Since you have such unique characters, does it make it more difficult to think of sequels?
Well, not for me, because this is 1965 and the next one's 1966 and the third one's 1967.
Job security.
Yeah, that's right, job security. I don't know how long I can keep it up. But the first thing I do is see what happened in the world, what happened, and the cryptic clue has one of the features is the opera house, because that was the year that it all fell apart and Jon Ertzen, left. So, I can dig into that, and that really gets the juices going. So, easy for me. Over to you.
Well, I dealt with my adult life, my career, so I had reverted back to childhood where I was brought up in the country. So I sent Ruth, that main character, to the country to be a locum as a solicitor in a small town where she completely stuffs everything up.
I probably just took the easy way out. I'm just not writing a sequel. I'm just writing something completely different. Yeah.
One more question.
How do you feel when you finish a novel? The characters, you're finished with them and you put them to bed.
Do you mean I feel
Yeah,
sad?
how do you feel yourself?
Well, generally, I think I finished it and I send it off to Gabby, and she says, "Oh, well, why don't you have another crack doing it?" I'm not sure it's ever finished until it's published, and then no, they'd done what they needed to do, and I was quite happy to send them on their way.
Because they feel really real to you, obviously.
Yeah, they do. Yeah. You can hear them talking.
Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, writing the second in the series, I really enjoyed getting back into the world of the Tea Ladies. As Joanna says, it's not like you write the end and it goes away and doesn't come back. There's a structural edit, and then there's an edit, and then there's the page proofs and da-da-da. but it felt very comfortable starting the next book. Oh, we're back in Zigzag Lane. What's going to happen here? The women come back on the page. I've already done a lot of work on them, and so yeah, I really, really enjoy getting back into the community of them.
Maybe I'm just not nostalgic enough, but I'm just kind of happy they're done and they're out there and they've gone, and I'm looking forward to the next lot of characters that I come up with. Yeah, just maybe I'm just always thinking towards the future. Maybe I'm not looking back on the book all that much. I kind of forgotten a lot of the book just reading it out then. I was like, oh yeah, that's...
Well, when you've
I
done a
remember
few
that.
and people ask you about a character, a few books ago, you go, oh, I can't even remember. What was their name? I can't even remember it. They're gone.
Oh, that's wonderful. Look, I think that's all we have time for this afternoon, but it's been a wonderful discussion and a wonderful, wonderful insight into the work of each of your works. Please join me in thanking Amanda. Don't thank me. Please join me in thanking Amanda, Joanna and Sean. And please don't forget that each of them will be available to sign copies of their books in the library foyer opposite the bookstore. Please buy these books. They are absolutely beautiful. You won't be sorry. Thank you again.
Thanks for coming.